Good evening, everybody. I just got permission to actually take a video that I saw a while ago and had permission to be able to copy this. Now, some of you guys are going to find this probably pretty boring, but it's really a good topic. And I know where I work at, it's always controversy. And I'm talking about personal conveyance. Now, for some of you guys that don't know what personal conveyance is, it allows us to be able to drive off duty. You probably heard me say it a few times on my videos where I said I think I'm going to go ahead and just put this to off-duty driving. Now, there are certain rules and regulations that allows us to do this, but there's also rules and regulations that tells us when we can't do it and why we can't do it. And drivers have been, for a long time, been trying to cheat the system when it comes to the LEDs, electronic logbooks. Well, I'm going to go ahead and put up this video, and I'm going to share the link to the people who actually made this video and to their channel, because I think they're very informative, and hey, you might learn something. So just kick back, relax, and see maybe if you don't get something out of this like I did.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Personal Conveyance in an ELD World. With the recent updates from the FMCSA, you may have heard another presentation on the subject, and we hope to dig much deeper in this topic by discussing what is personal conveyance, the changes to it, what isn't personal conveyance, ELD's role with personal conveyance, discussing company policy practices of personal conveyance, and back-end office management of personal conveyance. That is a lot to cover in just an hour, so I'm going to get some housekeeping items out of the way. This webinar is scheduled for an hour. Phones will be muted during the webinar, so please submit your questions in the chat box. I, Luke Kibbe, will be your moderator today, and I'm going to keep an eye out for the questions, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end so we can answer all of your questions. If we run long, we'll email questions and answers out after the webinar. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded. You will also receive the presentation and the link of the recording after the webinar. So keep an eye out in your email tomorrow. Our speaker today is Glostone's president, Dave Gray. Dave not only runs Glostone, he is also president of NATSA, a nonprofit of other trucking service companies like Glostone to present a strong national voice for trucking companies, small and large. Dave's also involved with IFTA and IRP, speaker at many conferences from trucking to construction industries to discuss FMCSA regulations. And we even put together an annual safety and compliance conference each January. That's free each year for local companies here in the Portland, Oregon metro area, or online attendees as well. I'm excited to have Dave share his knowledge to all of you today. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and dive in. Welcome, Dave, and you can take it away.
All right. Thank you, Luke. Hopefully you can hear me okay. We've been going through a few technical difficulties today, and I think we've got them ironed out, but we will get a start. And gosh, ELDs, we are about almost 10 months into ELDs, and I can tell you ELDs are still probably the top concern of the trucking industry today. There's still a lot of confusion, and I think there's still a lot of areas that the FMCSA need to address. I guess the one common good thing, I mean, there's carriers that are absolutely for ELDs, and there's carriers who are opposed to having ELDs, and no matter which side you're on. I think what the ELD thus far has shown is that the hours of service rules that have really been in effect since I think they go way back to the 1930s with some of the rules, that they don't have a lot of flexibility. They're pretty inflexible. And I think during the time when paper logs were allowed, a lot of that inflexibility was able to be hidden within the 15-minute increments of drawing the graph grids, and now that ELDs reign supreme, ELDs are very, very, very precise. Gone are 15-minute increments of keeping track of your time. ELDs will keep track of time, up into the closest 30 seconds. If you're within 30 seconds of a 30-minute break, it'll round it up. If you are 29 seconds within a 30-minute break, it'll round it down, and you'll be at 29 minutes, and you could have a violation. So the preciseness of ELDs had really brought out the inflexibility of hours of service in some types of operations. So obviously the preciseness is because the ELDs automatically record drive time once the wheels start turning over 5 miles per hour. So once that happens, you are on duty driving, and there's just been voice after voice within the industry just saying that it's so precise we can't do our type of operation, or we are severely impacted by that type of preciseness. So as a result, the FMCSA, to their credit, are listening, and we have a new FMCSA administrator as of the first of this year, and I know from industry, from what I read, they're giving him praise because he is setting up many listening sessions and trying to listen to industry and find out where the problems are and see where the rules can be made more flexible without giving up the main purpose of the FMCSA and the rules for safety. They don't want to go backwards on safety. So one of the areas that they have come out with for guidance, for some official guidance, and we haven't had this guidance for, many years, is in the area of personal conveyance. So that's kind of the focus of this one part of the rule that we want to look at today. And, again, personal conveyance is where a commercial truck or a bus driver can operate the vehicle while off duty and isn't subject to the on-duty hours restrictions while doing that. So we'll get into the definition a little bit more. And along with personal conveyance, and the guidance that they've issued, if you've kept up with the trade magazines here lately, you're also seeing that there's listening sessions going on for other proposed rule changes. And back behind those, Congress has gotten involved, and there's some legislation on the back burner to perhaps change the rules. But I think the Congress is waiting to see if the FMCSA will react. So if the rules that they're looking at, if you haven't read about them, the short haul exemption, if you're operating a large truck under the 100 air mile rule exemption, that you have a 12-hour day to do that. They're looking at maybe extending that to the 14-hour day and lining it up with the smaller vehicles, the vehicles under 26,000 pounds that are allowed to go 150 air mile radius in 14 hours. So they're looking at trying to and seeing what if it'll be just as safe to allow those bigger trucks to do their job in 14 hours. They're also looking at 2 hours for adverse driving conditions. So if they're looking at that rule and how perhaps extending the workday out for 2 hours if those adverse driving conditions are met. They're also looking at the hated 30-minute break rule and whether that is revised or just simply eliminated is being talked about at this time. and they're really looking hard at the split sleeper berth rule. And when they went to the 8 and 2, it really took that option away from most companies, and so now they're looking at the sleeper berth in different hour configuration, 6 and 4, or 5 and 5, or maybe going back to what it used to be. So anyway, they're looking at the rules, and more to come on that. But the personal conveyance they have put in guidance, which means it is in the rules. So let's start on that particular topic. So first of all, personal conveyance is a tool within the hours of service. It's not a required function, and it's really up to the carrier to decide whether they will allow personal conveyance or not. There are many reasons why a carrier would not want to allow personal conveyance. So they own the equipment. Their insurance company might have a problem with, drivers, employees just taking equipment for personal use. It could be, for a myriad of reasons. But it's really up to the carrier whether they allow personal conveyance or not. If the carrier does allow personal conveyance, the federal government has no mileage restrictions or time restrictions on what's allowable, because, as we'll talk about, personal conveyance is really the same as off-duty. So they have no mileage or times that you can be in personal conveyance. The carrier can set limits if it chooses. It doesn't have to either say, I don't want personal conveyance, I don't allow it, or allows it. They can put as if you're a carrier with drivers, you can say, I only want to allow my drivers to be in personal conveyance for not more than 30 minutes, or you can't go more than 20 miles. So it's really up to the carrier to set the limits, but the carrier should be extremely clear on their personal conveyance policy. So, the FMCSA really came out with a statement saying, as complex an issue as personal conveyance can become, it's a good idea for all carriers to spell out their position clearly with their drivers. FMCSA recommends that carriers have a policy in place on what they do or do not allow regarding personal conveyance, including any limits. So, key word in that statement, recommends. If they would say FMCSA requires, that would mean that all carriers must have a policy, but at this point they're only recommending. And if you as a carrier are going to limit personal conveyance in any way, you definitely want to spell all that out in a policy. All right, so Luke, next slide please. Thank you. So let's go into personal conveyance, okay, what it is. So the use of personal conveyance has to be legitimately using the commercial motor vehicle for a personal, non-commercial reason. So in general, so what does that mean? Personal conveyance cannot advance a load being carried, and I guess I would say personal conveyance cannot purposely advance a load being carried, because there could be a legitimate reason to be in personal conveyance that might move the load forward towards the final destination, but you're not moving it in that direction because of you're advancing a load. You're moving it because that's where the safe spot is. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So the technical jargon that the FMCSA uses is cannot enhance operational readiness. So the whole focus on personal conveyance and what an enforcement officer will be listening for as far as or reading on the annotations, the notes made, is the focus of the movement and the intent of the movement. So what in that driving time that was marked as personal conveyance was the intent of the movement. It used to be the truck had to be unladen in order to be considered in personal conveyance. So that really meant, tractor trailer. The tractor could unhook from the trailer and go to and be in personal conveyance without the trailer. And that was the only way. But in today, the guidance is it can be loaded or unloaded it no longer matters. The focus of what they're going to be looking at is the intent of the movement during that personal conveyance. So the driver is off duty to be in personal conveyance, and in order to be off duty, the driver has to be relieved from work and from responsibility by the employer. He's still driving the truck, and there could be a load in the back, but to be in personal conveyance, the employer, and probably would be part of the policy, needs to be stated, is relieved from work and responsibility up by the employer. Now, obviously, if you're an owner-operator, you are the employer and the driver, and so you would be giving yourself this authority. And but it's important to understand what the FMCSA needs to see and hear within the logs to be truly considered as personal conveyance. So Luke, advance it one more time, please. So again, personal conveyance does not impact on-duty time. Personal conveyance is an off-duty drive status and therefore has no effect on the driver's available hours of service or on-duty time. So in other words, no impacts from personal conveyance on the 11 or the 14-hour limitations for drivers, the 10 or the 15-hour limitations for bus drivers, or the 60 or 70. It's off duty. So it is stressed time and again that it is off duty and being relieved from all limitations and all to be responsible for the truck. However, in an ELD world, personal conveyance, the distance traveled in personal conveyance, the locations, through the pings of the GPS, the timestamps of those pings are all recorded, and it's transmitted when a driver transmits their log information during an inspection. So it's not that I can be in personal conveyance and this is now hidden. It is out there and in a personal conveyance mode within the ELD. It is going to be the data is going to be part of that transmission, and the officer receiving that data is going to be saying, okay, I see you've driven 8 hours, and boy, you've been in personal conveyance for the last 2 hours, but you kept going in a straight line and you passed 16 different truck stops where you could have parked. Why is this personal conveyance? So that information is still passed along, and the enforcement folks will be able to see it. So next slide, please. So really, I thought the devil is in the detail, and it really is. So we're going to go through some examples, and these examples, and I'm just restating what the head of the enforcement of the FMCSA kind of said in a listening session meeting with carriers and drivers. So, an example is a driver is delivering a load and it takes longer than planned, and it uses up the driver's available hours of service, and then the driver is told to leave the property. So what does the driver do? In the past, that would be probably buried within the 15-minute increments within the graph grid and in writing out a log. But at this point, obviously, you're going to go into drive, and the ELD is going to record it. However, the guidance is now, if the driver at that point goes off duty and moves the commercial motor vehicle under personal conveyance to the nearest safe parking spot to continue required off-duty time, yes, that's a legitimate use of personal conveyance. If the driver were to pass the nearest safe parking spot in order to get to another location that's closer to their next delivery or pickup, that's advancing the load and is not personal conveyance. So again, the devil is in the detail, and the driver really has to know the difference. So I'm out of hours, I leave the receiver, and I'm out of hours, so I don't want a violation, and I'm just going to go legitimately find the nearest safest spot. I go off off duty, or I go into personal conveyance, which is off duty on my ELD. Let's go to another example. So a move when the driver is parked and off duty can be personal conveyance. We ran into this with one of our clients not too long ago, where he was using an ELD and he had delivered his load, and he was out of hours and parked out in the lot to take the 10 hours off. In the middle of the night, in the middle of his 10 hours, the security guard comes up, raps on the door, and says, "You got to move. You can't be here." And so he was in the middle of his 10 hours, and he knew as soon as he goes into drive over 5 miles an hour, it's going to put him back into drive time and disrupt his 10 hours. But in today's guidance, that driver should go to personal conveyance and then be in personal conveyance, which again is off duty, which would not interrupt his 10 hours of drive time or 10 hours of off duty time. And he would be able to go find a safe parking spot. And so guidance has said that is allowable. Going to a restaurant, pursuing a personal activity, going to find a safe bathroom, moving the commercial vehicle in response to law enforcement. Law enforcement comes up and raps on the door and says, "You got to move." Again, that all is personal conveyance. So the caveat, again, we'll go over this because there's a lot of scenarios. The intent of the move must be personal in nature. It cannot advance the load, enhance operational readiness, or be for the commercial benefit of the carrier. So, again, it comes down to the intent, and if that closest safe spot just happens to be in the direction of where the truck would head out the next day, that is okay. But if the truck goes to bypasses the first safe spot to pull off and take the 10 hours and goes to 2 or 3 spots down the road, past 2 or 3 spots, then that is going to be considered by the officer as not personal conveyance, advancing the load. And if it's marked as personal conveyance, it's going to be a false log, which is a lot more trouble. So intent of the move is always needs to be considered. All right, Luke. So they did clarify location. There is no requirement that the driver return to his or her last on-duty location after a personal conveyance move. So in this example, if the driver left the receiver, he was out of hours and went into personal conveyance and maybe went 2 or 3 or 5 miles down the road to the closest safe parking, got his 10 hours, he does not need to go back to the receiver to that location to start his trip out. He can start the trip out from where he or she took the 10 hours. So there is no requirement to go back to where you first went on personal conveyance. All right, commuting and personal conveyance. This is going to be a big deal, I think, for the trades, those that commute to a job site, or those that maybe work at a terminal and are back home frequently or daily. So a commute with the truck to and from the terminal, job site, or similar location, if allowed by the carrier, again, it's got to be allowed by the carrier, can be personal conveyance. So, and again, the commentary from Joe DeLorenzo of the FMCSA is, if you truly are going from home to work, to the yard, to pick up a trailer, or somewhere like that, personal time driving to work is considered to be personal conveyance, and the same thing at the opposite end. And again, they stress there is no mileage limit. If home is 30 miles away or an hour away, there is no limit if you are truly commuting home. And we'll get into some where that can get confusing because the FMCSA also considers a trip to be the trip home is part of the trip and not personal conveyance. So it's the difference of reporting to a yard or a job site and then leaving from that yard or job site back home is commuting. But if you leave from home to go, if you maybe it's at the yard the night before, the truck is loaded, you go take the loaded truck home and you start out from home the next morning loaded to your destination, that's all on duty time. It's not commuting. All right, so next slide. Okay, so what about being forced to move? The driver who's forced away from the shipper, but is over hours. Okay, I think we covered that. It doesn't matter what direction. It may be proceeding in the same direction as the load. That's okay as long as it's the nearest safe location where you can get rest after those hours expire. And again, this is comments from Joe DeLorenzo of the FMCSA. So it's coming right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So being forced to move to the safe location. Now, a case could be said that, okay, here's a location where I could get my 10 hours of rest, but it's not safe. Somebody was mugged there last time I was here. My truck was broken into, but there's another safe place 2 miles further. Can I go there? And again, the devil is in the details. If you mark that you went to this location 2 miles down the road because it was a safer location than the first location, to me that is arguable. You might have to convince the enforcement officer, but you base your decisions on the safe place to get rest. So, on a safe place to get rest is not, in a wide spot in the road somewhere. So it's really in what is safe and what is not safe for personal conveyance, and where to go take your 10 hours. All right, let's move to the next one. So let's talk about what personal conveyance is not. So a driver under dispatch leaving home en route to a load is considered on duty. So if you stop at the yard the night before, you picked up the load and brought it home, then you travel to your point of destination from there, that's all on duty time. Operating at the direction of the motor carrier is not considered off duty. Driving bobtail, or with an empty trailer to retrieve a load is on-duty driving time, as is heading back to a terminal or yard after dropping off a load. Trips for maintenance or for fueling is on-duty time. We see this is probably the most common log violation that we see when we do log auditing for our clients is, the driver shows off duty, yet we have a fuel receipts showing that they were fueling the truck on that day, or the truck was taken for maintenance on that day. And that is a violation every single time when audited by the DOT. So make sure that your drivers understand, fueling is on duty time. All right, what's the difference between a commute home and going home after dropping off the load? And this is where interpretation comes into play, and really understanding how personal conveyance works and won't work. The driver needs to know, and this personal conveyance, the guidance that's being offered is not only for drivers, but it's also for enforcement officers to know and to understand, because that's the other half of the equation. So the FMCSA considers a load to be a round trip, either back to the original location or to the next location for pickup. The trip home is not personal conveyance. You cannot drop off a load and then head home. That is a continuation of the trip. So that sounds very similar to what we just said here a bit ago, where a commute is personal conveyance. And I think the devil in the detail here is that there's a job site or a terminal that the driver goes to start work, and that this trip, there was no terminal or job site that it was just it was a location to drop off the load. Maybe it could be argued if you had a dedicated load and the drop off was always at that same place, just it's almost as if the driver's terminal was there and then went home. Could that be considered a commute? It's a fine line, and it would be up to convincing the officer that it really is a commute, because it's the same drop off time after time after time, and I just head home from there. But however, if it's part of the trip in general, it's going to be considered on duty time. So going home is considered part of the return trip. So again, at a conference, listening conference, that Joe DeLorenzo from the FMCSA was asked that very question, and I guess there was a lot of murmuring in the crowd trying to understand the difference. So if you're confused, there's a lot of folks with you, and including enforcement. So it's going to be, I would err on the side of not getting the violation and not using it as personal conveyance and planning it into your trip. If it's something that it just has to be in order to make the particular route, profitable, and be able to make it within the hours of service, let's get it. Let's ask beforehand. Let's go to your local FMCSA and say, this is what I'm being faced with, and we drop off at this particular terminal. It's dedicated load. Can this be the terminal, and then the trip from there to my house be personal conveyance? I would get that cleared up in advance, because you as the driver, carrier might consider it personal conveyance, but if it's not clear with the enforcement officer that does the audits in your area, it won't matter. So still lots of room for interpretation within all of these rules. So let's talk a little bit about ELDs versus AOBRDs. The AOBRDs is the earlier version of the ELD that is allowable out there today. Within an ELD, to annotate, and again, annotation is still extremely important in the world of logs. And paper logs, you would annotate by drawing a line down, and you'd write out the annotation and maybe make a comment. With an ELD, you obviously have to type it in. So drivers with an ELD, ELDs are required to have a personal conveyance function. If your electronic device does not have a personal conveyance function, it's probably not an ELD. It's probably an AOBRD, because they may have had them, or they're not required to have one. But an ELD is required to have a personal conveyance function, where you go and you select personal conveyance, and it marks that time, and it keeps that time out of the hours calculations. So, and then you would also add an annotation as to that personal conveyance, going to the restaurant, going to wherever. I was talking with an enforcement guy that did a lot of log checks out at one of the local way stations here in Oregon, and we're probably about 150 miles from Spokane, where he was at, and the driver, he was auditing a log, and the driver was in personal conveyance, and he's headed towards Spokane, and asked, why are you in personal conveyance? You just left the city limits of Portland. How can you be in personal conveyance? And the response was, well, I'm going to Spokane. My favorite restaurant is over there. So that's not reasonable. 150 miles to go to the favorite steak place is not going to be considered personal conveyance. And so in an AOBRD world, your device may or may not have a personal conveyance function, but when you go into personal conveyance, you need to annotate the beginning time and the ending time, and then obviously a note as to to jog your memory, or to allow the enforcement officer to realize that yes, this was personal conveyance and it was reasonable. So it's all in the annotation. Annotations are still very important within the ELD world. Another important aspect of the ELD world, and those of you that are operating with an ELD, I'm sure already know this, is that there's a steep learning curve on the driver's side, and but once the driver gets the hang of it, and many drivers would not want to go back to paper log. They see the benefits. However, there is also a back end, a back office end, where ELD data is stored, where the ELD is configured to allow personal use or not personal use. What rule set are they using for the 60 or 70 hour rule set? There's a whole back office that needs to be managed, and that is the area that can really make or break an audit, because if you're not keeping up with your ELD in the back office, it can come back and bite you, because in an ELD world, the officers today, when they go through an audit of your entire file, will ask that you upload 6 months worth of your files, and the ELD must be able to do that. So it's not that they don't have to any longer come into your office and start thumbing through paper. You just transmit all of that data to them. And if you have, if you have unassigned driving, for example, and unassigned driving is where a driver did not log in to the ELD, and that truck recorded, the wheels turned faster than 5 miles an hour, so there was some driving going on. Obviously, it's unassigned. Nobody was logged in. Maybe it was the driver, forgot to log in. Maybe it was the mechanic. But that unassigned driving needs to be assigned, and it's done at the back office. It may need to be assigned to back out to the driver, and then the driver must accept it, and basically by accepting it, it's his or her signature that yes, it does belong to me. If it's not belongs to a driver, it belongs maybe to the mechanic, then it needs to be assigned to the mechanic, and notes need to be made. So this back office is extremely important, and I know for a lot of the owner operators that we help manage this part of it, it becomes a big deal. And logs, just because you're using an ELD does not mean that the logs don't need to be audited. A driver can still have violations. And a driver could be using personal conveyance as a method to advance the load just because he's out of hours. As a carrier, you cannot allow that to happen. You need to monitor those logs, and if it's illegitimate, what the FMCSA expects is, corrective action and training be done with the driver. Is the carrier going to be shut down for one instance? Absolutely not. But if 10% or more of your logs start to become suspect or not correct, the FMCSA just basically, when you start getting out your checkbook and having to pay, if they become false logs, that even becomes more acute, where the FMCSA finds out that it's actually illegitimate use and it's done on purpose, then it gets even more serious. So the log auditing still needs to happen. It should be easier to do in that the violations are, there should be a report that says, what the violations were, but it's still up to the carrier in the back office to now do something about it. So the logs, unassigned driving are all extremely important. And let's see, I can also tell you, in talking with some of the DOT enforcement folks, they are zeroed in on personal conveyance. in conversations over coffee, they will tell you that their fear is that personal conveyance is a loophole, and that many drivers are going to be going into personal conveyance to advance the load and get into accidents because they were had run out of hours, they were tired, and so in their pursuit of auditing logs, when they come across personal conveyance, they're going to pay attention to it. So all of that personal conveyance mileage and time and data, as I mentioned before, is collected, and it will be audited. So it's very important that the drivers understand and comply. And as the carrier, that you make sure that your drivers understand and are complying by auditing the logs. So, Luke, I think I made it through. Hopefully there's enough time for questions, and questions are always the tough part because it's always specific, seems to be like specific questions about my particular operation. Is it or isn't it? And I will do the best I can if there are any questions out there.
Yes, and thank you, Dave, for the presentation. Lots of great material covered. There are already 2 questions that popped up. Again, if there's more questions that you have, if it's specific to your company or more general, please feel free to pick Dave's brain now. Type it into the chat box and we'll touch on it. We got about 15 minutes, so we should be good on answering some of these other questions. So Dave, some of the questions that came in, one of them, and I asked around as well in the office, but are you aware of any best practices relating to personal conveyance and company policies? So for company policies, any best practices of what should or shouldn't be in it?
I really do not have any great examples. We as a company with that help the smaller carriers with the required company policies, we have not developed kind of a template for a personal conveyance policy. But I think a lot of it, if I was a carrier, the first place I would start is with my insurance company, because if in the fine print of your insurance policy, if they don't allow personal conveyance and you allow it as a carrier and an accident happens, you have no insurance. So that would be my first place to start. And if you want personal conveyance, make sure your insurance does cover that. So that would be my first and foremost suggestion.
And I was asking around the office as well, and Heather Gray mentioned that if you're doing personal conveyance in your company policy, a lot of it obviously it's going to depend on what's your industry, what is your, if you're in construction, are you going to be using it more? Is there more potential of you using it and abuse of it? And so parking is always going to be something you need to maybe spell out, only using a certain time for the personal conveyance if you allow it, and detailing what that is. But if you do have something specific that you're detailing out of, this is what you should be doing, how you should be using personal conveyance, the flip side to that is in the policy, you should have some kind of basically disciplinary action if there's abuse, and making sure that there's some kind of check that you're checking for. That's part of that back office. If you're seeing drivers abusing a personal conveyance because you're seeing the ELD logs and the annotations, or maybe you're worried about it, making sure that those things are in place gives that policy a little bit more power if you're going to try to enforce it for your drivers. Another question that we had. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
That I was just going to say that that progressive discipline, or the addressing the issues, is kind of throughout all of what the FMCSA expects throughout all of these regulations. That if if a regulation is broken, once, twice, once in every great while, it's not a big deal. It's when they start to see it being broken time and time again, and nothing is done about it. That's when they realize or determine that the safety culture within the company is not where it should be, and then corrective action plans are required of the carrier, and so forth. So it's knowing the rules, recognizing when the rules have been broken, but then doing something about it to keep it fixed.
Great. And another question that we had, I'll just read it exactly. It says, if using personal conveyance to go home to the terminal, how is the pre-trip and post-trip noted? It seems that this should be on duty.
Well, a pre and post trip is on duty. So, so if you're ending your trip at the yard and you're going to commute home, so at the end of your trip, you would do the, post trip, or when you got to the yard in the morning to pick up, if you drove your truck to the yard and to hook up to your trailer, you would do your pre-trip at that point in time, or your post-trip, before you go into the off-duty personal conveyance. So I don't think the pre and post-trip is to be ignored because you're in personal conveyance. It should be done at the beginning of the day, once you go on duty, or at the end of the day once you go off duty into personal conveyance.
Perfect. I'm going to give you guys a couple more minutes to ask any more questions. We've got some time, so feel free. Go ahead, write it in the chat box if there's something we've missed, or if you want more details, write it in the chat box, and we'll try to answer it. As we wait, I did want to cover that, as Dave mentioned in the presentation, that we help with that back office. If it's something ELDs, it's a brand new world. It's a lot of new tasks that maybe your back office is not used to, and this is something that we have help a lot of our clients. Everything, and we don't care what ELD you use, we'll be able to provide the back office support in optimizing your ELD data and your ELD equipment for your specific company. Part of what's included in that is we'll manage the in-cab ELD telematics data. It requires a much different back office skill and than the paper-based process, and that's why a company like us, we have that expertise. We work with hundreds of carriers and owner-operators with some of this back office work. The use of our ELD, you can use our ELD or telematics tech, or bring your own, which is a huge benefit. So if you have one already, if you don't have an ELD yet and you're thinking about getting one, Glostone is a reseller of Geotab as well. So I don't see any other questions. Let's see. Yep, I don't see any other questions coming in. So we can go ahead and end this presentation. Thank you, Dave, again, for touching on this subject. It's a lot of information here that I'm sure there's going to be more questions come up as people play with it. So carriers or anybody on right now, if you have any questions, feel free, reply to the email that you'll get tomorrow with the recording of this webinar and the slides. Reply and ask us any questions. I'll make sure Dave's email's in, or our phone number's in there as well in the email, so you can give us a call if you have any questions, and we will be glad to help answer any of those questions. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and end this presentation. Thank you.